If you like what you see, go ahead and subscribe to see more of our content. And also make sure to ring the bell if you actually want to see our content. Thanks, YouTube. If you really like what you see, you should know that we did this all with a budget of 2 shoelaces and some pocket lint. Just imagine what we can do with an actual budget. By checking out our Patreon, you can find out. As of today, I can add Chris L to this list of our rare tier patrons. On top of that, thank you to all of our other new patrons at different tiers. You're helping support the channel while also getting early access to our videos. You should definitely start with our affiliate link down in the description whenever you make a purchase over at TCG Player. Alright, that's the shameless promotion out of the way. Let's go ahead and get into the video. Hey everyone, it's Matt here, and welcome back to our 1-year anniversary of our first upload. So let's get this party started. But in all seriousness, welcome back. You may have missed it, but earlier this week we uploaded our first video in a new series. Devin and I are attempting to use it as a venue to sit down and talk about the game as a whole, from current events and updates to more meta-analysis. We want to cover as broad strokes of a look as we can. In this episode, we gave our first takes on Commander Collection Green, and the first real information we've gotten from Commander Legends.
I also really want to know who in the product design team loves Omnath so much, because it just seems like Omnath's everywhere. It'll always be everywhere.
Yeah, so if that sounds interesting to you, go ahead and check it out. The link's right here. The format is a work in progress, and kinda goes at its own pace. But we do have episodes for Zendikar Rising, the 2021 release schedule, and a channel Q&A in the works. Every so often, an idea for a game is suggested by our players. This is one of those games. For our 1-year anniversary, we have a pod of 4 players who took the phrase "kill 'em with kindness" a little too literally. Basically, we have 4 group hug decks at the table this week. The players are anxious to go ahead and hug each other to death, so let's go ahead and jump into player introductions. First off this week, we have Josh, playing Selvala Explorer Returned. Josh's Selvala deck relies on repeatedly parlaying with Selvala, while using the life gain and draws he receives to trigger various effects on his board. He kept Everflowing Chalice, Ghirapur Orrery, Swiftfoot Boots, Second Sunrise, Wirewood Lodge, Canopy Vista, and a Snow-Covered Plains. Next up is Spencer, playing Kruphix, God of Horizons. Spencer's Kruphix deck is looking to force his opponents to make tough choices on what cards to keep in hand, while he has the opportunity to store both his mana and maintain every card he draws on his path to decking everyone out. Spencer kept Tempt with Discovery, Vision Skeins, Nissa Who Shakes the World, a Forest, and a pair of islands. Then comes Grayson, playing Braids, Conjurer Adept. His deck is looking to give everyone additional draws, while also allowing them to cheat in non-planeswalker, non-enchantment permanents. And he's looking to get ahead by having the biggest threats to cheat in. Grayson kept Strionic Resonator, Arcane Signet, Cyclonic Rift, Mind's Aglow, and a trio of islands. Last but certainly not least, we have Danny, returning his Kynaios and Tiro deck from a temporary retirement. Danny's looking to use the King's ability to naturally get ahead of his opponents, while also rushing out various gods and using them as a distraction as he tries to mill out his opponents as well. Danny kept Path to Exile, Rites of Flourishing, Sunpetal Grove, Temple of Mystery, Stomping Ground, Hinterland Harbor, and Frontier Bivouac. This game begins simple enough, as Josh drops a tapped Canopy Vista. Then Spencer and Grayson each drop an island, and Danny drops a tapped Temple of Mystery, before leaving the card he scries on top to close out round 1. Josh drops a Plains. He casts a Collective Voyage, and here's where the real game begins. The table collectively pays in a total of 3 mana, and each player goes to grab these 3 basics to the battlefield tapped. And with the game now officially on turn 4, Josh passes off. Spencer drops an island. He casts a turn 2 Nissa Who Shakes the World, and then immediately upticks her to untap and animate a forest. What is this, standard? He probably should hit someone with his Vigilant Forest, but that's not in the spirit of hugging, so he decides to begin the real game by casting a Howling Mine. Grayson draws 2 for turn and puts in an island. He casts an Arcane Signet, and follows up with a Strionic Resonator, before passing off to Danny. Danny draws 2, and shocks in a Sacred Foundry. He casts the Rites of Flourishing, which in turn ups everyone's draw and land per turn count. Finally, Danny plays an untapped Sunpetal Grove, and passes off to Josh. Josh draws 3 for turn, and then plays both a Wirewood Lodge and a Forest. He casts an Essence Warden, and I'm just going to level with you now. I'm not going to mention this card at all this game. I'm just going to uptick his life total as it happens. Josh then casts a Swiftfoot Boots, and follows it up with his commander Selvala. Selvala gets a new pair of boots, and then Josh parlays. Everyone reveals the top card of their library, and then draws it, as Josh adds 2 green mana, while also gaining 2 life. He doesn't have anything to do with that mana though, so it fizzles as Josh passes off. Spencer draws 3, and plays 2 forests, before reminding everyone that this is where the real game begins. He casts a Mirror Maid, and has it enter as a copy of Danny's Rites of Flourishing. He then follows it up with a Tempt with Discovery. Each of his opponents is tempted, and they go to bring in these untapped lands, as Spencer goes to bring in these 4 untapped lands. Spencer doesn't feel like he's drawn enough cards yet, so he casts the Kami of the Crescent Moon, before immediately following it up with a Rishkar's Expertise. And as Expertise resolves, Spencer draws 3, and free casts a Font of Mythos. He then remembers he has a Planeswalker on board, and upticks her to untap and animate another forest. He still hasn't drawn enough cards though, so he casts some Minds Aglow. As a total of 8 mana is paid into the Minds Aglow, each player draws 8 cards, before Spencer moves to end step and discards down. Grayson draws a total of 7, and drops Temple of the False God, Eldrazi Temple, and an island for turn. He then shows off his mono blue ramp by casting a Mana Crypt, a Soul Ring, and a Chrome Mox in quick succession. He also exiles a useless Search for Azcanta with a Mox's Imprint trigger. However, this isn't enough mana for Grayson, so he casts a High Tide. And he also wants some more draw power, so he follows up with his own Kami of the Crescent Moon. Grayson brings us back to elementary school with a Show and Tell, which he uses to cheat in an Emrakul, as Danny and Spencer each cheat in a Dictate a Kruphix, and Josh subtly drops a Smothering Tithe while claiming this.
Look, it's so I can hug more.
Grayson then casts his own copy of Minds Aglow, and Danny responds with a Vision Skeins. Each player draws 2 cards, and no one's able to pay, so Josh creates 6 total treasures. Minds Aglow then resolves, and a total of 8 mana is paid in, before each player draws 8 cards. No one pays their taxes again, so Josh creates a total of 24 treasures, as Michael says this off camera.
Is this competitive?
Grayson then casts a Font of Mythos, and in response, Josh raises Danny's spirits with a Benevolent Offering. He and Danny each create 3 spirits, and then he and Grayson each gain 2 life for each creature they control. Font of Mythos then resolves through, and Grayson follows up with his commander Braids, which he enchants with a False Demise, before closing out his 3rd turn of the game. Danny cheats in a Kruphix God of Horizons with Braids on his upkeep, before drawing 12 cards for turn and paying for none of them. Danny shocks himself 3 times to bring in Temple Garden, Hallowed Fountain, and Stomping Ground untapped. Danny then reminds everyone this is where the real game begins, as he casts a Howling Mine. He follows that up with his commander Kynaios and Tiro, before casting a Veteran Explorer. Danny then moves to his end step and triggers the Kings. He draws and puts in a Forbidden Orchard, as Josh and Spencer each draw, and Grayson puts in an untapped Mystic Sanctuary. We then resolve all the triggers, and Grayson puts High Tide back on top of his library, as Josh creates 2 more treasures. And as time begins to spiral back onto itself, we begin round 4. Josh cheats in the Great Henge on his upkeep, and then draws a total of 13 cards for turn. He parlays with Selvala, and adds 3 green mana, gains 3 life, and forces each player to draw a card, which in turn creates 3 more treasures from Smothering Tithe. Josh then casts an Avenger of Zendikar, which creates a total of 8 0/1 plants as it enters, before triggering the Great Henge for the first and last time Josh remembers for a bit. Josh then casts the 1000-year elixir and uses it to untap Selvala, before immediately parlaying again, which in turn adds a total of 1 more green mana, 1 more life gain, and 3 more treasures. Josh then uses Wirewood Lodge to untap Selvala, and parlays yet again, which in turn adds 4 green mana, gives Josh 4 life, and causes him to create 3 more treasures. Next comes a Roots of Life, and Josh names Swamps. And there's actually a pretty neat interaction which happens here, so Josh also has an Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth in play. At this point, whenever one of his opponents taps a land for mana, Josh will gain a life. Josh plays a Forest, an Ancient Tomb, and a Nykthos Shrine to Nyx as his lands for turn, before putting a total of 3 +1/+1 counters onto his plant tokens. He follows up with a Seeker of Skybreak, and uses its ability to untap Selvala again thanks to the pseudo haste from Elixir. We parlay again, and Josh adds 3, gains 3, and creates 3 treasures. Now you may have thought this happened earlier, but as Josh casts the Psychosis Crawler, the real game begins. In response, Danny casts a Frantic Search, and as Josh gains 3 from Roots of Life, Danny draws 2, discards 2, and untaps 3 lands. And as Josh creates his treasures from those draws, Danny remembers to give Spencer a ghost of a chance in this game from Forbidden Orchard. Psychosis Crawler then enters the battlefield, and Josh realizes this.
This thing is a 1, 2, 3, doesn't matter.
He follows that up with a Suture Priest, and then casts the Temple Bell. He immediately activates the bell, which forces each player to draw a card, and this in turn pings each of his opponents from Psychosis Crawler and causes Josh to create 3 more treasures. Josh then casts both his own copy of Font of Mythos and Rites of Flourishing, before playing a Temple of the False God and adding another +1/+1 counter to each of his plant tokens. He then shocks himself to tap Ancient Tomb, which leads to this response from Danny.
Oh no, he took damage.
And it's here in the 12th or 13th hour of Josh's turn that we remember all of his Great Henge triggers. We quickly resolve them as best we can, before Josh continues on with his game of Solitaire. He casts a Horn of Plenty, and follows it up with a Girapur Orrery, while also paying a mana into Horn of Plenty's trigger. Magerite's Stone comes next, and Josh pays into Horn of Plenty once again. He uses the stone to parlay with Selvala again, and adds 3, gains 3, and creates 3 treasures, while also pinging each of his opponents. And as we pass into our 50th Aeon, Josh begins to dig through his library with the Great Henge, and he casts Soul Warden, Orzhov Advocist, and Oracle of Moldiah throughout this process. After the Oracle enters, Josh plays a Command Tower, before adding some more +1/+1 counters to his plants. He casts a Magus of the Vineyard to dig some more, and in response, Danny reminds him this is a multiplayer game by pathing Psychosis Crawler. The Crawler is exiled, and Josh goes to bring in a tapped Forest, which adds another round of counters to his plants. Josh's turn then continues with a Keeper of Progenitus, and he draws from the Great Henge again as it enters. He then suspends a Hypergenesis, before casting an Evolutionary Escalation. He digs some more with both a Wall of Shards and a Spurn Mage Advocate. And after the inevitable heat death of the universe occurs, Josh decides this is where the real game begins, and draws from Horn of Plenty at end step, before discarding down and passing off. Spencer puts in an Avatar of Growth with Braids trigger on his upkeep, and as it enters, each player somehow manages to still put in 2 untapped basics. Spencer then draws a total of 16 cards, and puts in 4 forests and a fabled passage as Josh creates his 16 treasures. Spencer then cracks the fabled passage and goes to bring in an untapped island. After that resolves through, I ask this.
Cards and libraries? That's more important than life totals right now.
Before Spencer casts a prosperity where X is 30. And it's around this time that Josh realizes he has 28 cards left in his library. He casts the Beacon of Immortality that he has, targeting Spencer, in an attempt to save himself. But as Spencer's life total is doubled, Josh realizes that it isn't enough. Prosperity resolves through, and each player draws 30, which decks out Josh. After that, Spencer casts what would be a game-ending windfall. And in response, Grayson casts a High Tide. Danny responds to that and flips High Tide the bird. And after creating his 2/2 bird, Grayson hard counters Windfall. That's pretty irrelevant to Spencer though, who casts a Skull Wander. And as it ETBs, he returns Windfall, and Danny ultimately returns Vision Schemes. Spencer then tries to Windfall again, and in response, Danny gives Grayson the spirit to continue on as he recasts Vision Schemes. Each player draws 2, and this surprisingly isn't enough to deck out Spencer. So with that, Danny decides he wants to escape this eternal game in the most group hug way possible. So this happens.
Resolves.
Okay, we windfall.
You withdraw more. You lose. But you all win.
In all seriousness though, from both of us and our players to you, thank you for your support over the past year.